Many of the boys who go down to the front will be wounded. Many of them will be killed. But Jews at all periods in the world's history have been ready to make the supreme sacrifice whenever the land that gives them shelter demands it. I know that I voice the sentiments of the overwhelming majority of the Jews in the United States when I say that we will do our share towards keeping Old Glory floating proudly in the sky so that it may continue to shelter under its folds the downtrodden and the oppressed of every land. Typical of the Jewish family's commitment to the war effort was one of Mrs. Gustav Jacobson of New York City. After the declaration of war, her oldest son, Gustav, enlisted in the army. Two more sons, Harry and Samuel, joined the Signal Corps. Another son, Simon, signed up with the gas contingent. Her fifth son, Benjamin, joined the 305th Artillery, and her sixth son, Jacob, enlisted in the aviation branch of the service. Her seventh son, Daniel, remained at home because he was only 15. Within the year, Miss Jacobson received word that Harry had been killed, Simon had been wounded, and that Jacob had been injured in an airplane crash. One day, the youngest son, Daniel, disappeared. A search for him proved futile. He was nowhere to be found. When armistice was declared, 5 of her 6 sons had returned home, 2 wounded and 1 killed. On a Sabbath eve, Daniel also returned home. He had changed his name and falsified his age so he could enlist and serve in the Marine Corps. The Jacobsons served their country without any hesitation, and the mother, Mrs. Jacobson, never complained. To offer 7 sons to the service of our country was a tremendous sacrifice. More than 250,000 Jews served in the armed forces in World War I. They received 1,135 decorations, including 3 Congressional Medal of Honor. There were more than 9,000 commissioned officers, including 2 generals and an admiral. Approximately 3,500 were killed and more than 12,000 wounded. The JWB, Jewish Wars Veterans, was organized in 1917 to help meet the war needs. It established 200 centers with more than 500 workers in the training camps and 57 centers overseas behind the trenches. It also helped with enlistment and with raising funds for the war. Once again, Jews responded to our country's call to help it repel its enemies, though we can remain free. So just again, in the 20th century, not only they were dealing with business, and like we told a few important stories about that, but also they took their weight in the military. And we're running out of time, and we really don't have the time to talk about all the great heroes of World War I. And like I said, really I knew that would take more than time allotted for us. But let's just conclude with, go back to inventors. And we know that this is another great field of America, the great country of innovation. So Emil Berliner, his legacy of innovation and invention. Emil Berliner The Bell Telephone Company bought his invention and appointed him Chief Electrical Instruments Inspector of the company. He was with the company for a number of years and continued his experiments with electricity. Berliner became interested in aviation and engaged in many experiments which led to his introduction of the use of a revolving light engine. His attention focused on the helicopter. Between 1919 and 1926 he built 3 helicopters which he tested in flight himself. Berliner was also involved in the fields of hygiene and health. In 1890, he organized and founded the Society for the Prevention of Sickness. He also organized in 1907 the first milk conference in Washington, D.C. for the pasteurization of milk and the improvement of its quality. He was very active in the fight against the spread of tuberculosis, and he wrote many articles on hygiene and preventive medicine. In 1899, Berliner wrote a book, Conclusions, that speaks of his agnostic ideas on religion and philosophy. At the end of his life, He supported the rebuilding of Palestine and was very active on behalf of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He died in 1929. His son Henry Adler Berliner was an engineer who worked with his father on the pioneering experiments with the helicopter. He was president of Berliner Aircraft Incorporated in Washington, D.C. from 1930 to 1954. In World War II, Henry was the chief of warplanes for the 8th Air Force and lost an arm in combat. Emil Berliner, through his innovations and inventions, left a legacy to America which his son continued with distinction and honor. Well, one more field that we needed to talk about was engineering and science. We'll talk about the great scientists, of course, Albert Einstein and the like. And but nevertheless, again, just it's very interesting to talk about just the different. We call them the Jewish heroes because they gave the Jewish people a good name. Immigrants from many different cultures had a hard time. The Irish, for example. People in America, unfortunately, didn't like the new immigrants. They were different. They talked a different language. They had different habits and different customs. So therefore, it was important for these new Americans to make the proving ground for America that say, yes, we are a people, we are a good people, and we're ready to help out America, and we're ready to help it thrive and do the better, whatever we can to help out America. And exactly why we call them the heroes, because in certain senses they really did do that. We talked about the business organizations, we talked about the labor, and we talked about the culture. And in many ways it was hard for new people to get its roots in a new land, but to these Jewish heroes that we talked about today, they did a good job and to give a good name to the entire Jewish people. Thank you very much. Shalom. Welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Delmar Chabad Center, and today again our topic is going to be Jewish heroes of America. Now we talked about in previous shows about the different aspects of the country that the Jewish people have excelled in. We're talking about arts, the sciences, and we're dedicated a show to sports. But one idea that many people don't understand is that Jewish people are also military heroes in this country. Now we talked about once that the Jewish people were, even though it's small numbers, they were heroes in Civil War. Today we're going to be talking about, though, a little bit more modern history. We're going to talk about the Korean War and the Vietnam War, where the Jewish people enlisted, participated, and we're going to hear now a few times where they actually became heroes of these war efforts. Now, I don't know, again, of course, your political views, how you felt about the Korean and Vietnam War, but let's keep in mind that our government did call upon our national forces, which means our people and our sons and daughters, to fight the war, and all political reasons behind that, they had a job to do, and they did it, and they should be at least honored for accepting that duty, and number two, for, like we're going to see now, actually excelling in that duty. So this is Corporal Abraham Geller, hero in Korea. That in the morning they were going to fight their way towards the Korean capital. An hour before dawn, the only ones awake were the sentries. Captain George O'Connor, who was figuring out strategies to use when the regiment moved ahead, and Geller, who started his morning prayers. He directed and coordinating When Geller finished praying, O'Connor told him to get a cup of coffee from the chow truck. "Thanks, Captain," said Geller, "but today is Yom Kippur, and I'm not supposed to eat anything until sundown." O'Connor was amazed that Geller wouldn't eat until the day was over. Geller fasted and observed his holiday as well as a Jew could when in combat. That morning the regiment moved forward. The advance moved slowly as the enemy put up stiff resistance. The casualties were high for both sides. The fighting was so heavy that it was 3 hours before Geller received a shot of penicillin. He was then carried into the operating room. The surgery lasted an hour. O'Connor waited for it to be over. When the surgeon came out, he was there to greet him. "How is he doing?" O'Connor asked. "He is doing well. The bullets went through his abdomen, and the penicillin was a factor in preventing peritonitis. In a matter of speaking, Geller owes his life to the fact that when he was shot, there was hardly any food in his stomach." O'Connor shook his head as he started to understand a little more about the meaning of fasting on Yom Kippur. Tibor Rubin, an unusual hero of the Korean War. Tibor Rubin's bravery during the Korean War is probably unparalleled in the history of American fighting forces. That is why many organizations and individuals are involved in a major campaign to have Congress award him the Congressional Medal of Honor. Rubin, a Hungarian Holocaust survivor, lost his parents in a Nazi concentration camp in the latter part of World War II. Rubin, who had learned to survive in a Nazi concentration camp, applied his experience to sneak out during the night to steal food from the Chinese. He would give this food to the other prisoners, especially the sick and dying. Every time he went out for food, Tibor was risking his life. He felt that this was his way of getting back at the enemy, as they were short on food for themselves. Tibor was a prisoner for 2.5 years. His fellow prisoners credited him with saving 35 to 40 lives with his daring, almost nightly ventures of stealing food for his comrades. Tibor turned down a number of offers from the Chinese to send him back to his native Hungary. Tibor Rubin and the others were finally released and sent back to the American hospital in Freedom Village, Korea. He was a stretcher case, still suffering from his wounds without complaints. He had been recommended for the Congressional Medal of Honor by the Jewish War Veterans of the United States of America, Korean Prisoner of War Association, many of his comrades in the prisoner of war camp, individuals, and other organizations. Many heroes received their awards and recognition through an action that could take minutes, hours, even a few days. Tibor's heroism and bravery was to be over a 2.5-year period, never knowing when he would be caught and executed. Tibor Rubin is currently residing in California. The campaign to have him receive the Congressional Medal of Honor for his unparalleled heroism and bravery is stronger than ever. We must give full recognition to heroes like Tibor Rubin. All right, so we have a few stories back in the Korean War, some 40 years ago now. And still we have to remember that what people did for our country and the heroism that they actually excelled in during that time, ultimately for us. A little bit more modern, but still 30 to 20 years ago, we're talking about Vietnam. Again, maybe people didn't appreciate the war, which maybe they have reason to. But again, like we said, that they were called from the president and the army to do a job, and they did take up the call and did the job. Colonel Jack H. Jacobs, Medal of Honor recipient, Vietnam. The highest traditions in military service, has reflected great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. Jacob also received 2 Silver Stars, 3 Bronze Stars, and 2 Purple Heart medals. Jacob is a resident of New Jersey and is involved with investment banking. He is designated as a Brigadier General in the event of mobilization in the defense of his country. Jacobs is the 15th Jew to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. His heroism and gallantry in battle follows a long line of Jewish heroes who have given themselves to defend his country from its enemies. We'll continue on with interesting stories about Vietnam. As much as many people, when they were against the war, there were people there fighting bravely for our side, including the Jewish people. Private First Class Stuart Burr, a hero in Vietnam. Private First Class Stuart Burr of the United States Marine received a Silver Star Medal for his bravery in Vietnam. By his courage, bold initiative, and unwavering devotion to duty, Private First Class Burr upheld the highest traditions of the Marine Corps of the United States Naval Service. His gallantry gave his life in the service of his country. Burr was raised in Passaic, New Jersey, where he graduated from Passaic High School. He was on the high school's track and cross-country teams. He had been in college for 2 years when he decided to enlist in the Marine Corps to fight in Vietnam. His family received the Silver Star posthumously at a Passaic City Hall ceremony. Rabbi Solomon Weinberger of Tiferes Israel in Passaic remembered Burr as being a leader of youth who unselfishly gave of himself to help others. In addition to the Silver Star Medal, Burr received the Purple Heart Medal, the Vietnam Campaign Medal, Vietnam Service Medal, and the National Defense Medal. Burr is one of the many Jews who had fought and died for his country. His name will always be among those that are Jewish heroes in America. So on the battlefield, of course, there were many heroes, but now something in the officer ranks, we have to also remember the people who led the military, and we're going to talk about 2 Vietnam-era Jewish generals. In every war which the United States was involved, there were Jewish generals in leadership roles. Vietnam was no exception. Major General Stanley Hyman and Robert Solomon had major roles in the Vietnam War. Hyman was a major when he received the Legion of Merit by the direction of the President of the United States. Born on December 14, 1930, in Baltimore, he has a Master of Science degree from Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore. He is married to the former Frances Nathanson, and they have 3 children. Hyman and Solomon have contributed to the legacy of Jews who have served their country in war. So even on the field and now in the officer corps, there's always Jewish people ready to serve their country. Now 3 more Jewish heroes of the Vietnam War. In the Jewish War Veterans Museum in Washington, D.C., He then went to government service in Washington, D.C. Briskin, Sedek, and Goldstein are three of the thousands of Jews who fought in Vietnam. Some died, some were wounded, some brought the mental scars of war back with them. Again, as an American past war, as Jews respond to their country's call for fighting men. So as we take you through the Korean and Vietnam War, that we wanted to just be sure that that the Jewish people had their mark and their heroes, and the Jewish people fought bravely and heroically with the United States fighting forces. But of course, as we all know, is there is people who need to fight on the field, and we need officers. We also need, of course, special people, which are the inventors of war, and also the not of war, God forbid, but of the military and the higher personnel and the politicians. So therefore, we're going to talk about a very, very important person in the American scene, Admiral Hyman George Rickover, father of the atomic-powered Navy. Vice Admiral Hyman Before long, he was placed in charge of the project and worked with the Atomic Energy Commission, which was going to build the reactors. The reactors was built in Idaho, the submarine in Groton, Connecticut. Finally, in January 1954, the first atomic-powered submarine, the Nautilus, was launched. Despite his success, Rickover faced opposition both towards his work and towards his open criticism and remarks. After he had been twice passed over for promotion to admiral, the naval codes require retirement if promotion is denied twice. Congressional leaders suspected that he was a victim of foul play. Following an investigation, he was named a rear admiral in 1953. His many plans for nuclear ships were put aside during the congressional hearings. He is often credited with being President Jimmy Carter's mentor, but was a critic of President Reagan's defense budget, when he considered to be wasteful and too large. In 1982, he was forced into retirement at age 82. When Rickover retired, he expressed regrets on the role he played in nuclear proliferation and called for an international agreement to outlaw nuclear weapons and reactors because of the radiation dangers that they pose. So behind the military, as it goes, good generals and admirals in our case, that have the ideas in order to equip our army with the absolute best level of armaments. And this is very interesting, and they talk about women's liberation today, but we're talking about an assistant defense secretary, a Jewish woman, Anna M. Rosenberg. When Anna M. Rosenberg was sworn in as the Anna Rosenberg became involved in politics in the early 1920s. She made many important political connections in the ensuing years. When Franklin Roosevelt was elected governor of New York, he frequently consulted her on labor matters. In the 1930s, she served the federal government in many capacities, primarily in labor and human relations. In 1937, she was named chairwoman of the New York State Constitutional Committee, and in 1938, she was named by President Roosevelt to a committee to study industrial relations in Great Britain and Sweden. During those years, she developed a consulting business, which was very successful. She served on many committees and boards during World War II. She was the director of the Office of Defense and regional director of Health and Welfare Services. She was a member of the New York City and State War Councils and held the secretariatship of the President's Combined War Labor Board. In July 1944, Anna Rosenberg was sent to the European Theater of Operations by President Roosevelt as his personal observer. She did the same for President Truman the following summer. After the war, she served on many boards for the city and state of New York. In the Korean War, Anna Rosenberg was appointed to a 12-person committee to advise former Air Secretary W. Stuart Symington on the mobilization policy. After she was appointed the Assistant Secretary of Defense, she worked with Secretary George Marshall on a draft for the Senate Armed Service Committee, which became known as the Universal Military Service and Training Bill. Rosenberg received the Medal of Freedom in 1945 and the U.S. Medal of Merit in 1947. She continued to serve her country through the years. In 1968 and 69, President Johnson appointed her to serve on the Commission on Income Maintenance, which exempted all welfare and income support programs. Rosenberg died on May 9, 1983. She was a model for Jewish women to follow in service and dedication to our country. In her own way, she was a Jewish hero. We're talking about Jewish heroes in the war and helping the war effort from on the field, in the officership, and on the scenes. We truly see that Jewish people did take a part and are Jewish war heroes in America. Thank you very much. Shalom. Welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Delmar Chabad Center, and today we have a special guest star, Yisroel Simon, his topic is going to be Jewish sports stars in America. How's everything? We'll call him Sruli.
How I'm doing fine.
I wanted to start talking with you a little bit about, the audience probably figures that you're a little bit young, which you are. On the other hand, though, you're very well read, and truth is, you don't have to have a PhD scholar to learn about Jewish sports stars, because sometimes they make a joke at some of maybe the skinniest book around. People know that there aren't that many Jewish sports stars. But truth to tell, there have been some, and there have been some very great Jewish sports stars. So maybe tell us about the Baseball Hall of Fame, which isn't that far from the Capital District in any case, the Jewish greats that are in the Hall of Fame, and they of course went there because of their great merit. And tell us a little bit about a few of the biographies and the accomplishment of some of these baseball stars.
Well, there's only two Jewish Baseball Hall of Famers. There's Hank Greenberg and Sandy Koufax. Hank Greenberg was real good. He could have been better if it wasn't for his prime years in the military.
Well, what tell us about that then?
He was enlisted into the army, and then he was discharged. But
which years?
He was discharged. It was 41, and because they said, and then because they let all the people discharged, and then they called everyone back because they bombed Pearl Harbor, but you didn't have to go back if you were 28 and older. But Hank Greenberg went back even though he was 30 years old, and he missed 4 years at his prime time, you might say, and 1 year with a broken wrist. So he could have been way better, and he could have hit about 550 homers instead of 330 homers.
So that was his 330 homers is pretty good. What did it tell me about some of his best seasons?
His
Who did he
best.
play with?
He played with Detroit in his 5 best seasons. Like one of them was when he hit the 58 homers. Another one he hit 170 RBIs. Another was when he hit 183 RBIs that year. And one time he hit he batted 340, his highest ever. He batted 339, and his lifetime average was 313.
So those are good statistics to get you into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, and he also had 63 doubles 1 year.
The 58 home runs is always a famous story that they talk about, and that is that